Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on the need for communication systems. This is one of the videos in our Module 5 series, and what we're going to be doing here is the first section of Module 5, which is looking at communication and homeostasis. This particular video is having a look at the specification references 5.1.1a, the need for communication systems in multicellular organisms, and 5.1.1b, the communication between cells by cell signaling. So let's get started. If we start off with the most fundamental concepts then, in terms of what cells need to be able to survive, we hopefully know that they need a suitable pH, and depending on which cells will determine what pH that actually is, a suitable temperature, an aqueous environment, and they also need to have this environment that's free from toxins and excess inhibitors for them to actually function properly. Now, one thing that we should be aware of is that when we're talking about cells and organisms, then it's not just one environment we're talking about. We have both internal and external environments that we need to concern ourselves with. If we start with the external environment, first of all, then if we've got a change that's occurring in the external environment, i.e. the surroundings to the organism, then that could put that organism in a state of stress. If the conditions are not ideal for that organism, it's obviously going to have to do something about this in order to survive. They obviously need to carry out some kind of monitoring so they can detect when this external environment is not ideal, and then they need to carry out some kind of behavioural or physiological change that will allow them to reduce the effect of that stress on themselves. One of those words that hopefully we remember from GCSE is the word stimulus, which is just referring to a change in the environment. And of course, the response is going to be the change in either the behaviour or the physiology of the organism in response to that stimulus. If we think about some of the more gradual changes that occur, and this could be something like the change in seasons that sort of occurs regularly. Let's be honest, if we're living in England, what are seasons these days? They certainly don't seem to adhere to the old standards. But gradual changes, those seasonal changes, can lead to changes in organisms. And I've given you two rather cute little pictures of organisms that have these seasonal changes. So we've got the Arctic fox in both pictures, same organism. So on the left we have the Arctic fox with its lovely little winter camouflage, lovely little white coat and super fluffy, as we can see. Looks like it'd be cute to give a cuddle to. Don't cuddle an Arctic fox, you may regret it. And then on the right we have our Arctic fox in the summer months, where you can see its coat is now a brown. It's certainly less dense than it was because it's warmer. So we don't have the snow, therefore being white would make it stand out against the actual grassy background. So we've got those changes in the coat colour that occur as a result of the seasonal changes as well. If we get a more rapid change to the environment, this could be something like a predator arriving in the area, or it could be as simple as coming out of your burrow or your cave into bright light. That's obviously a rapid change to your external environment. The other side of things is the internal environment. So hopefully we remember from some of our work in Module 3 that we have our cells surrounded by that stuff called tissue fluid. Now, what we actually find is that this tissue fluid is going to be critical for these exchanges that are taking place. And as these cells carry out the range of metabolic processes that they require for their basic function, we're going to be using up the substrates and producing the products. Some of the products that we are going to be producing are not necessarily good for our organism. They may be toxic. And if they are released into the tissue fluid, they will alter the internal environment. So we've got to have some kind of a method for dealing with those as well. Good example of this is carbon dioxide, something that we did look at back in Module 3. If we get an increase in carbon dioxide in our tissue fluid, then that's going to result in a decrease in pH. If we alter the pH, that can then have an impact on the function of enzymes. Because if we go back to our Module 2 work, we know that our enzymes are going to be operating over a narrow range of pH values. and therefore if we've got an increased amount of carbon dioxide leading to a decrease in the pH, we may well fall outside of those tolerances for our particular enzyme. So look out for questions like this, where we are getting links between the work that we're doing now in things like our Module 5 and where it ties back into the Module 3 transports or the Module 2 basic biomolecules and obviously enzymes and the factors that affect them. Because just because we're starting a question to do with communication systems doesn't mean there's not going to be a part later on that talks about enzymes. We can also have another situation where the products that are being produced as the result of these metabolic reactions inside our organisms will directly act on those cells. Now, what we're going to find is that in that scenario, we're going to get a reduction in the cell activity, and that can reduce the amount of the waste produced. So if our products are actually acting on the cells that produce it directly, we reduce the amount of waste product, but we're reducing the activity of the cell as well. So any of those useful products that were also being made alongside it would not also be made. Therefore, we could see this negative impact on the organism there. One phrase that hopefully we remember from GCSE is homeostasis. And when we're talking about homeostasis, you were probably taught at GCSE that this is the maintenance of a constant internal environment. Now, if you've had a look at some of the past A-level questions, then there is one that comes up which then discusses if the word constant is actually suitable here. And you will see that they actually suggest the word stable is more appropriate. We'll look at this in more detail in our next video as to why we've got that difference between those two phrases. But the key thing about our homeostasis is that if we're trying to keep this internal environment within these narrow ranges, then we've got to have the ability to monitor and obviously deal with any of these products. So what we're really talking about in our homeostasis is the monitoring of the waste products and other substances and making sure that we are keeping any changes to those concentrations within our acceptable limits. If we think about one key example in a lot of living things, then we are talking about blood maintaining that composition of the tissue fluid. Now, blood is obviously one of those key things that we've talked about in biology quite a lot at this stage. It's all about transporting substances around the body and therefore allowing substances to be brought to cells and waste products to be removed from those cells. So basically that removal of the waste products means they can be transported to whatever region of the body they will be excreted by, and any of the useful substances that are entering the body in a particular location can be brought to the cells. So the blood is almost like that little transport system that's going to be bringing everything to the right places at the right times. Now, throughout our biology course, we've actually had a look at different types of organisms, some of which are unicellular, so single-celled, and others are multicellular, so have many cells. If we then consider the differences between these, the multicellular organisms are actually more efficient than unicellular ones. And the reason for this is that if we've got many cells, then we can specialize those cells to carry out a particular role. So when we're looking at our multicellular organisms, they'll have undergone that process of differentiation to give different cells for different roles within the whole organism. Whereas a unicellular organism, that one cell, has to do everything. So clearly it's not going to be specialised for one particular role. It's got to be a little bit of a jack of all trades, able to do a little bit of everything, and therefore it's never going to be as efficient as the multicellular organisms with their specialisation. So when we think about our multicellular organisms and the fact that they've got these differentiated cells, each with their own particular function in the body, then obviously we may not have the bits that are carrying out the monitoring in the same location of the body as the parts that are involved in removing the waste product, for example, or producing the waste product. They could be in different locations. So if we've got these different regions associated with that same overarching principle of removing something, then we've got to have some kind of communication system between all those parts that are involved to ensure that the body can function efficiently. And if we think about the basics of one of these communication systems, then hopefully these are a little bit of common sense on the most part. It's got to be rapid at communicating, so that obviously we know the situation and can therefore bring about changes quickly. It's got to be specific, so that we are able to bring about the exact change that's required. It needs to cover the whole body. It needs to enable those cells to communicate with each other and have both long and short-term responses, because obviously different situations will require different end results. So one thing that we're talking about here is the idea of cell signaling. And this is again a concept that keeps coming back up in biology throughout the course in different areas. So cell signaling, if you remember, is the way in which our cells are able to communicate with one another. And quite often this will be one cell releasing a chemical which the other cell is then able to detect. And we've actually got two major systems of communication that are working in the organism through this cell signaling. The first is the neuronal system, and that comes up in a later section of Module 5, and the other hormonal system. And again, there's a whole section of Module 5 dedicated to the hormonal system. If we just give a quick overview of these systems first of all, we'll go into depth in them in the later videos. The neuronal system first of all, this is obviously using neurons, which are all an interconnected network that are able to signal each other across synapses, gaps between the neurons. And the key thing about this neuronal system is that it allows for rapid conduction of those signals and therefore rapid responses. On the other hand, we've got the hormonal system, which is using blood to transport those chemicals, typically hormones, which are released by the endocrine glands. Now, those hormones are then going to travel through the blood to the target cells, which have the receptors for that particular hormone, and then we will get a response to its presence. Key thing about this is that those target cells have receptors that are specific to the shape of that particular hormone, and therefore not everything in the body is going to respond. Only those cells with that receptor will respond to that particular chemical. And the advantage of our hormonal system is that this allows much longer term responses. As always, I hope you found this video useful, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you can see when the next video is uploaded. And of course, head on over to the website where you can get an array of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.